so excited to have you all here today with us to talk about AE and SDR goals that actually stick with the only Pete Kazanjy. My name is Eduardo. I am a community events manager at Modern Sales Pros, and I am your host for the next hour. For those of you who are not familiar with modern sales pros, we're definitely missing out because we are the world's largest revenue leadership community for those in sales management, sales revenue and operations, sales and revenue operations, sorry, sales development, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission is to create a great environment for our 20,000 and growing members to answer questions they would struggle to solve on their own and to help them see around corners they may not know about. We do that through great live sessions like the one you're about to experience today, through our robust online forum, and hopefully in the near future, in-person events. And if you like the content, and I'm sure you do, you will love our Revenue Excellence Summit happening this April from the 12th to the 14th. And you can get pre-registered in the link that I'm going to put in the chat soon. I have some housekeeping notes for us before we start the fun. And the first one is that this event is going to be recorded, and you will be able to access this recording and the key takeaways from Pete on the previous events page, a page on the MSP website, so you can always have the great information when you most need it. And second, if you have a question for Pete, please use the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to to get to them during the event. I know that Pete loves to answer questions, so please do use the Q&A section. Um, Sponsoring our event today is and telling us all about AE and SDR goals that actually stick is our founder and parent company, Atrium. So I'm going to go ahead and let Pete introduce Atrium and himself and run the show from here. I'll be back at the end for a few closing notes, but now it's time for Pete to shine. Pete, the stage is yours. Please have fun.
Thanks, Eduardo. I appreciate it. Here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I'm kind of unfortunately, I'm working off of one laptop screen right now. So as to normally here, you guys get to see like infinite wall of of Goldcast there. I'm actually with my family in Mammoth right now, and just popping out of just here to do a little goal, goal management masterclass here. But yeah, Atrium. So Atrium is a software company I'm the founder of. I lead revenue there. We make data-driven sales management software that helps AE, SDR, and AMCSM managers use the metrics and data to improve team performance. And one of the really great things about Atrium is it's so quick to set up. It takes about 90 seconds to set up a free account and just get all the data-driven assets that you could possibly want in order to improve performance of your team. A little bit of background on me. I just noted earlier that I'm the founder of Atrium, also the founder of Modern Sales Pros, which is absolutely fantastic. Prior to all of this, I actually started another software company called TalentBin. It was a recruiting software company where I was the first, a founder, and then our first rep, first sales manager, sales leader, et cetera. We were on to roadblock 14, and then that's kind of like where I was responsible for new product sales for a 1,000-person sales organization. I also wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales, which is all about modern, operationally excellent, analytically excellent sales. So I think a little bit about sales. Can you tell? I can tell. Cool. So what we're going to talk about today is goals, and specifically goals that actually stick. That are going to help your teams be more performant, help you manage them better. One of the things that I am a really big fan of is kind of like literature on these topics. So a couple of examples of some books I've been reading recently on data-driven sales management as relates to the goals and what have you is 5 Secrets of the Sales Coach by Corey Bray and Hillman Sori, and then also The Qualified Sales Leader by John McMahon. It's kind of two of my favorite books, kind of sales excellence books recently. If you'd like to get a copy of these and also Coffees for Clears Yeti Mug, I think we're going to drop a hyperlink in the chat for folks to be able to sign up for those. So go ahead and hit that link and drop your deets, and we can get you those assets there. Cool. So let's talk about goals here really quick. So why are goals important? And what it comes down to is that everybody really wants to win the game. But the problem is that like winning the game is like a really big monolithic like output goal. And so the problem is like you need to know, are we on our way to winning the game? Are we scoring enough points? And not only are we scoring enough points on our way to winning the game, are we doing the precursors to even scoring the points? Are we taking enough shots? Are we getting the ball enough? And kind of like what does our quality of that look like? You know, what does our shot percentage look like? And so the thing there that's really important is that if we know that it's execute the right quantity of action of the gameplay, problem is to actually pay attention to those precursors. And so kind of give you some examples of what this looks like in practice, just to kind of analogize it for folks. If you look at some of these inputs and outputs, at least for example, output metric there, runs, right? Are we scoring enough runs? But the input metrics are things like, okay, well, in order for us to get runs, we have to have hits. And we need not just hit, but we have to have like multiple bases, right? Like a double or a triple is better than a single. Are we hitting? And then, of course, on the flip side, if we're a pitcher, what do our strikes look like? Are we throwing strikes? Are we getting strikeouts? Are we getting outs? And the same is true on the flip side with respect to efficiency and quality, right? So it's insufficient just to mention those input metrics. We also want to look at what efficiency is looking like. Like batting average is probably the best example of this, right? If we're getting a bunch of hits, but it turns out that our batting average is quite low, that means we're probably wasting a bunch of our at bats. And so by paying attention to these kind of more granular metrics and setting goals on them, it allows us to see the future. The second thing too is that goals and these kind of precursor metrics by themselves, the whole purpose of them is to change the behavior of the staff and the players that are executing the gameplay, or in our players. And so this is important. The aggregate batting average across your players on your team is actually not a very interesting number. It's actually not very actionable. Similarly, that aggregate win rate across all of your AEs is not the most compelling metric in the world. Because again, what we want to do is fundamental unit of output in our teams is the individual player and kind of leading indicator about these goal indexes that we can get very granular. And so what kind of so we can get understand these goals are very granular to understand which of our players has softness where, such that we can end them better. And so what we want to do is we want to get leading, and we want to get leading. We want to get leading, and we also want to get very human. And so then the question is like, okay, well, that's cool, Pete. Excuse me. That's cool, Pete. I get it, but how do we actually go about that? And that's what we like to call data-driven sales management. And so this is actually about 6 steps that you have to do in that regard in order to kind of get to that level of like using data in order to improve team performance or rep performance. And so first, you got to select the relevant metrics. Then you have to do the relevant data collection in order to ask those questions. Next, you actually have to set goals on those metrics, because it's insufficient to say, hey, we're paying attention to customer-facing meetings or SDR email volume or SDR call volume or what have you. It's insufficient to even say that, but not actually and to say, and this is the goal that you're supposed to hit. This is the response rate that we're expecting for our SDR team. So you have to set those goals, and then we actually have to look at it. We have to visualize things. So we have to build the relevant reporting and dashboarding in order for us to be able to visually inspect these things. And then once you've built those various resources, well, the next thing is you actually have to make sure that you're consuming it. And so consuming this information
really
and looking at it in order to detect.
Your Wi-Fi is a bit
Uh-huh.
choppy, and we can't see the screen super well. Are you able to change areas for us? I'm working on it on my end if I can.
I don't think so, because on my hotspot here.
All right, I'm gonna hop
So
back
the
and see.
screen isn't
Oh,
coming
sorry.
through?
The screen is coming through, but the audio is a bit choppy. So it'll kind of break through and then it'll speed up a little bit. Ooh.
Interesting.
Let's like maybe would it be better if I shared the screen as you talk through, or do you think it won't make a difference? Okay.
Perhaps we can try that.
Okay. Let's do that. And we are on. Okay, I can share my screen whenever you're ready.
Go for it.
Okay. 12. All right. And
or did you want to put it in the media?
Yes, it's up. Do you see it?
Got it. So you put it in the media. You're not sharing your screen.
No, it's in the media. Yeah.
I understand. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, hopefully this will work a little bit better. Thanks, Taylor. I appreciate that. Wonderful. So back to what we were talking about before. What you need to pay attention to is, so it's insufficient just to create those assets, but then you also need to be able to visualize it, right? Visualize the because that's the whole idea here, is that we want to be able to use our eyes in order to detect issues that are going on there, in order to understand, are we getting to the relevant goal levels there? And then the last thing, then in order to ensure that that actually is happening, is we want to distribute this information to the relevant stakeholders. So that means like making sure that broadcasts are happening, making sure that broadcasts are happening appropriately, making sure that these assets are hyperlinked as appropriate. And then lastly, the whole idea here is that if we are able to see see issues in real time, the important thing is, what we want to be able to do is to troubleshoot, right? And actually drive to resolution there. Because just seeing the potential issues, but then not taking action on them, is actually not all that terribly helpful. And so this right here is kind of like a visualization of what that looks like in practice. You can see down at the bottom there, we have to know what metrics to track, then we collect the data, build the relevant reporting, and then monitor for aberrations, and then diagnose the relevant issues in question. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of run through a number of what these things look like here, or how to actually achieve these relevant things. So first, let's go ahead and talk about metric selection here. The big thing there is, one, what you want to pay attention to is like, well, hey, what teams are we going to be instrumenting, right? So different roles have different metrics requirements. So if we're looking at account executives, then the metrics that we're going to be looking at will probably be things like customer-facing meeting volume, right? Or new opportunity ownership, or total opportunity ownership, or opportunity advancements, right? So understanding, and that actually might be different, or it is certainly different than if we're instrumenting an SDR team. And so in that case, the output metric that we might be looking at might be something like opportunities created, right? Or pipeline created, or maybe qualified opportunities created. But then the input metrics would be things like customer-facing email volume, or customer-facing call volume, or the number of, unique number of leads that have been engaged, et cetera. And a really great way of kind of thinking about what these KPIs might be that we should be paying attention to is saying, hey, what do these people spend their time doing? Or more importantly, what should they be spending their time doing? Because based on that, that's the thing we can say, okay, if they're supposed to be spending time doing this, this is the level, like these are the metrics that we would then track to see, hey, is that time being spent on that and at the proper amounts? And then we can set goals on that. Another thing to kind of note here is like really what you'd like to do is kind of start basic and then get more advanced. Most organizations are pretty, in the kind of like more basic area of kind of like the life cycle here. That's totally okay. And so what you want to do is you want to start basic. But the important thing is just you do want to start. So even if that's like with respect to your SDR team, looking at very basic things like total activity volumes, or email volume, or calling volume or what have you, and then output metrics like meeting creation or opportunity creation. That's totally fine before you get into more sophisticated things like new accounts that are being touched or new contacts that are being touched or what have you. Okay. And so those are, but the important thing is like to just start, because oftentimes things that we see is that folks go ahead and like they spend their time talking about like paying attention to, rather than saying, oh, okay, well, let's just start this behavior and then we'll be able to get more sophisticated over time. These are some examples of what that might look like in practice. These are just kind of like some suggested metrics by role. You got the inputs and the outputs kind of going across the top there, and then you have the different roles going down the side there. And then also an important thing to kind of think about is how the different metrics interact with each other. So this is an example, this is a visualization here of what we call the AE revenue formula, where it has bookings on the left side of the screen, and they kind of over, as you go further to the right, it has precursors to those to those bookings. And then of course the same thing for the SDR, SDR role here with respect to pipeline management, pipeline generation. Cool. So then with respect to, so once you kind of know the metrics that you want to be paying attention to, then the next step here is data collection. And so the thing there is like, we have to be able to collect the relevant data in order for us to do these calculations and see these various metrics. One thing that's to really kind of think about is, can you automate data collection as much as possible? One of the big challenges that you'll get with adherence to and compliance with respect to logging information in the CRM will be just like the onerous amount of overhead that your reps have in kind of like logging different things. And so instead, if you can automate that, it's a far more compelling experience. You might think, oh well, like I really want my reps to be able to like signify the 4 different types of like meetings that we have. But then the question is like, is the level of information that you're going to get out of that, or like the reporting that you're going to be doing on it, really worth the squeeze? Like, is the juice worth the squeeze on that manual logging, or can just automated meeting logging like pull up the calendar and shoves it into the CRM for you? Can that get you far enough to do the analysis you want? Usually it's better to push that towards the automated side of things to make sure that so you're reducing that logging threshold on folks. Cool. So if we know what metrics we want to pay attention to, and we're logging the relevant information, then the question becomes, okay, now we actually have to set goals on these various metrics. And so the mechanism by which to do this is kind of like, you can kind of take a blended approach there. Really the big miss that a lot of organizations will have is they'll say, hey, we're going to pay attention to these metrics right here, but they don't ever put a line in the sand and say, hey, we have an expectation that you have this many new opportunities that are coming into your pipe per month, or this, as an account executive, we have an expectation that you're supposed to have this level of customer facing meeting volume, or you're supposed to have this many opportunities that are in your pipe at any given point in time. That's actually really important, both from a managerial standpoint to understand like what good looks like and like where somebody is off as compared to good. But it's also really important for the reps to understand that as well, because the more the reps understand where they're at, or like where they ought to be at, the more that they can actually help out and manage their own business as an owner and do better self-management in that regard. So then the question becomes, great, well then how do we actually set these goals in a way that is, that is appropriate and defensible and what have you? And so there's a number of different ways that you can do that. The first there is to use historical performance. So one thing that can be very compelling is you can go back in time and look at what those levels have been over time. Like look at your account executives and say how, like in general, what does their opportunity ownership look like over time? Or over time, over the last 6 months, what is the per month new opportunity inflow look like for all of those account executives? Maybe it's the team member, or you might look at your top performers in order to get a fingerprint of success and say, hey, we're going to take like an 80% haircut on where their, where their values are for those various goals. So that's like historical performance. The other thing you can do is you can do a bottoms-up approach. So what you can say is you can say, hey, look, this is what these people are supposed to be doing. These SDRs right here are supposed to be sending customer-facing emails and making calls. And because of our, the type of sales motion that we have, our SDRs are primarily email driven, as opposed to calling driven, let's say. And we have them sending these relevant sequences, and the first email in the sequence they're supposed to customize along these ways right here. And then what that can do is that this can add up to a certain amount of time. So then once you know how much time is required in order to do that thing, and it's better to kind of like be more generous here versus saying like, oh wow, someone can like do, if somebody's really 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 focused, they can spend 5 minutes and like send a customized email. Well, maybe it's actually more like 10 minutes, but regardless, you can bubble up what that amount of time ought to be, and then say, great, there's 8 hours in a day. This amount of time is spent for internal meetings, this amount of time for like lunch break or whatever, this amount of time for mental health breaks, kind of like bathroom breaks, et cetera, et cetera. This is the amount of time we would expect people to be spending doing actual prospecting. This is the amount of time we would expect them to be doing like inbox management or what have you. And then just divide it out and say, great, based on that, we should see this amount of email volume in a given day, or this amount of call volume in a given day. And so that's like a bottoms up model, and that can be done with SDRs, it can be done with AEs, it can be done with AM, CSM folks as well. And then the last thing you can do is you can use benchmarking information. This can oftentimes be a little bit more challenging to get access to, but what you can do is if you can get information from other teams that have a similar sales motion to you, and this is actually something we do with a bunch of our customers, is at this point we have many hundreds of customers that have very similar sales motions to each other. They're kind of in like pockets. Our customer success team will help people say, okay, this is around what we're seeing the cut as like a good number of customer facing meetings for mid-market account executive that sells into a sales operations function, or this is a good meeting volume for an enterprise rep that sells into security or what have you, right? Can be a little bit harder to do if you don't have access to that information. That's why kind of like third-party benchmarking can kind of be helpful there. But if you can get it, it can be helpful. And then what you can do is you can blend together these things. So we talked about historical performance and bottoms-up modeling and benchmarking. Usually like any one of those is probably not going to be the right approach. If the more of these that you have that you can kind of blend together, what you can get to is you can get to like a defensible rule of thumb, and then start using that and then iterate it as appropriate, right? And so one of the things that can be really helpful there is you can say, hey, I'm going to take this historical performance information, this bottoms up data. I'm going to like then set a goal right here. I'm going to maybe set it a little conservatively because I want everybody to be able to hit it. And then over time, what we can do is like, as people are hitting that goal, we can say, oh, actually, well, maybe that should be 10% higher, or maybe it should be 15% higher. And this is where you can actually use like spiffs and incentives and what have you in order to figure out like what the true level, like what that true level ought to be. Because if you're spiffing people on opportunity creation or customer facing email volume or like meeting volume or what have you, and people will want to outperform in order to attain those spiffs. Well, what you've now done is characterize what kind of like the true level of performance could be, and then you can set that goal, maybe at that level, maybe a little bit below that level. So those are kind of the principles there. Some examples of what that might look like in practice here. Again, some of these things are going to vary more broadly, like customer facing email or meeting volume for account executives. It can't vary that much because guess what? Like there's 40 hours in a week, as compared to like bookings or deal cycle or what have you. Those things can kind of like be spread a little bit further, but these are like a good kind of like rough levels that you could kind of you'd be probably pretty solidly defensible if you wanted to like take some out of here. And then the same thing is true over here on the SDR team as or like the SDR function as well. Right. So the important thing is like we want to start and we want to set at least some of these goals here, because that's going to allow us that's going to put in place the needed foundation for us to then interpret it and then change behavior and do a better job in managing So let's actually talk about then, once we've set these things, we've got, next we actually have to pay attention to this. So visualization is the mechanism by which we do that. And let's talk to what some of these principles look like here. The first thing, so normally the way to think about visualizations is reports and dashboards. And so the way to think about this is that a report is answering a specific question, right? So an example of that would be like, how many opportunities have the SDRs created so far this month? Or how many opportunities does each AE own right now? Right, that would be answering a question. And that might be different than another question, like how many opportunities does an AE own right now, as compared to over the last 6 months on a monthly basis, how many opportunities has each AE owned over that time? Those are two different questions. They answer two different things. They're both important questions, but they're different. And so then what a dashboard is a dashboard is an amalgamation. It's an aggregation of those discrete questions. And so usually the way to think about an effective dashboard is not like, hey, let's just like do the kitchen sink here and throw a ton of information in here, but more, this dashboard is for use at this point in time to answer these sets of questions. And so usually a place where that ends up being really effective is in usually where that ends up being really effective is in various meetings, right? So like a team meeting, or in preparation for a team meeting, you might want a dashboard that has the set of things that I want to monitor on a weekly basis to make sure that my team is set up for success. And this actually might be different than, this is the dashboard that I use in my one-on-one with this rep right here, or each of my reps right here, and it has a different set of metrics as compared to that team meeting dashboard that has other metrics and other reports that we're paying attention to there. An anti-pattern that a lot of people run into is people just kind of like throwing as many things into a dashboard as possible. And what that does is creates a situation where you're like literally just looking at this gigantic wall of charts, trying to figure out what the hell is going on in here, versus targeting it down and saying, hey, this is the round robin dashboard right here. It has 4 tiles on it. It shows me how many opportunities each account executive has in their pipe right now to see who's low and who's high. It tells me how many opportunities have come into their pipeline in the trailing 30 days. So I can see if one person is being overfed versus somebody else. It might tell me another thing, like how many opportunities came into each AE's pipeline last week. And like, that's fine as a dashboard to say, hey, this is our round robin dashboard. It answers these sets of questions right here. And then this dashboard right here, maybe the SDR team looks at it every morning in order to see, oh, which account executive needs to be topped up, for instance. That's an example of a very targeted dashboard with a very specific set of questions that to be answered. Cool. So some of the different ways that folks go about doing this and making these visualizations is, one, CRM reporting. So oftentimes your CRM, prototypical CRM, like whether you're talking about Salesforce or HubSpot or what have you, will have reporting functionality in place. The challenges associated with that is that well, like the upsides of that is that it's very flexible and oftentimes very powerful. The downsides associated with it is like, A, not only does everything have to be built from scratch, but then B, people actually have to like use their eyeballs in order to look at the various graphs and charts in order to figure out, if somebody's going down or if somebody's low on the new opportunity inflow or what have you. Another mechanism by which people will oftentimes do this is with business intelligence. So something like like Tableau or Looker or what have you. Again, extremely, extremely powerful. The downside, of course, is that it's even more challenging and kind of like more specialized than typical CRM reporting. And so oftentimes requires specialized staff in order to kind of build dashboards or build reports for you. So kind of blocks the ability of an individual manager or rep to kind of like ask the next question there. And again, has the same kind of issue of, hey, look at this like wall of charts here, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on within there. And then the kind of last mechanism by which organizations will oftentimes try to solve this is what we like to call data-driven sales management software. And so this is kind of like a new category of software that's purely focused on using data to improve rep and team performance. And so it's got upsides and downsides as well. The upside associated with it is it's extremely quick to set up. Usually takes a few minutes to do so because it has every KPI you could want already pre-baked out of the box. The downside is those KPIs are pre-baked, right? It's not like a specialized version of win rate where it only has these opportunities that got to this stage or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's win rate, the number of wins divided by wins plus losses, like win rate, right? And so the downside of it is that it can be a little bit less customizable. But the upside, again, associated with that is that because all those metrics are predefined, it can be automatically monitored, continuously monitored statistically, rather than having people having to use their eyeballs in order to interpret what's going on there. And just as a little bit of shout out to our own organization, this is literally what we do at Atrium. So we make data-driven sales management software, and the whole point of which is to help AE, SDR, and CS managers use data to improve rep and team performance. The cool thing about it is it only takes about 2 minutes to set up. You're up and running, in a few minutes there, and then the data takes about a couple hours to sync, and then you're on your merry way. There are thousands of reports that are already pre-baked, but then more importantly, the software is continuously monitoring this for you in order to say like, hey, Pete, this rep right here is under his opportunity ownership goal. You should probably check that out. Or, hey, Pete, this SDR right here, she's sending fewer customer-facing emails in the trailing few weeks than she has been historically. What's going on there? That seems like something you'd want to investigate there. And so the idea here is that it's literally everything that a manager would need in order to use data and metrics to improve the performance of their team, already made for them and then monitored for them, so they can spend their time coaching and getting ahead of these issues, as opposed to dashboard diving or like doing battle with CRM reporting. So that's our little advertisement there. So let's talk about what some of these visualizations might look like in practice here. So I think I actually may have skipped this earlier, but oftentimes a great way of thinking about visualizations is kind of when you have a metric, you might want to have a total and a total and a trend. What that allows you to do is see, and I can't really mouse right here, unfortunately. It'll show you how many, what is happening in a given time period. And then also what you can see is what that trend looks like over time. So oftentimes pairing these visualizations, like a total plus a trend, can be very powerful. And like putting them side by side in a in a dashboard that's consumed in the relevant meeting can be really helpful, because you can say, hey, here's how many customer facing meetings have happened or on the calendar this month. And then very quickly what you can do is you can say, oh, this rep is low right here. That's interesting. How long has he been low? Oh, well, let's go ahead and look at the trend information here and say, oh, okay, yeah, he's just down just this week. Or, ooh, actually, it's been an issue over time. Yikes. Maybe I should get ahead of that and have a conversation with him in order to address address what appears to be a potential issue here. And so that loop I just talked about, like having those visualizations there, looking at it, seeing if there's a potential issue, and then having that conversation in order to resolve that problem, or at least detect if there's actually a problem. That's like that loop is how data-driven sales management happens. And the first thing that is needed in order to do that is these visualizations, so that you can actually see what's going on there. So like this is a good example. These examples right here are customer-facing meetings. You can do the same thing with like opportunity ownership as an example. Again, like a total with a trend there. We can see in this case, which is Michael Darling, the orange line kind of there at the bottom. We can see that he's kind of been trailing off over time there, and that's a good thing for us to maybe get ahead of. These don't have to be just like these can be for other use cases as well, like a pipeline height pipeline hygiene might be another example of a use case here. In this case, these are untouched opportunities as a KPI there to help us understand if our reps are doing a good job of staying on top of their pipe, or and also how that's been trending over time. In this case, you can see that like the team used to have kind of a pipeline management problem, and then somebody intervened and put in place some reporting and operating rhythms in order to help them get much better at pipeline management. And you can see the entire team has a decline in untouched opportunities there. And then the last kind of example I wanted to use here in terms of visualization is ramping, right? So obviously ramping is like the ramp period for account executives and SDRs is a really kind of dicey time for the organization or for those reps, because you're not at that output level yet, right? So you're not at bookings, you're not at full productivity with respect to wins or full productivity with respect to bookings and what have you, because turns out, like say you have a 60-day sales cycle, the earliest that a rep is going to be having those wins is going to be 60 days after they started taking opportunities, and they're probably not going to have like a high win rate off of their first cohort of like opportunity inflow there. And so this is where it becomes really important to pay special attention to those leading indicators, and also seeing how those leading indicators compare as to others at the same point in ramp. Right? Because it's easy to say, oh, well, that person is ramping and that's why they're low compared to the rest of the team, the rest of the like ramp team. Well, what if they're actually low compared to all those other people at the same point in ramp? Well, now we know we actually have a problem there. And so this is where visualizations around ramping can be really, really impactful. When you're thinking about how you set up a dashboard, like when you're kind of designing it or conceptually, this can kind of be a helpful way of thinking about this. Like, what is the metric that I'm going to be paying attention to? What is the time period in question? And then what is the grouping, right? So in this case, you can see that we have our bookings by rep, wins by rep, meetings by rep, what have you, and the time periods. Actually, there's a typo on this slide. The time periods in question are, it could be this week versus last week, for instance, there. And then this is what this can kind of look like with respect to goals in a more tabular view there. Cool. So now let's talk about distribution and consumption. So we talked about actually setting these things up. Well, the next question would be, are we actually paying attention to it in order to detect these potential issues and then engage in like active coaching in order to resolve those challenges? And so the mechanism by which to do so here is, one, like the kind of the principles here is like when you're thinking about distribution, you've got URLs and then emails and like report and dashboard email or emails. So usually most most software for reporting and dashboarding will actually have discrete URLs for we'll have discrete URLs for the for each report and for each dashboard. And so one of the things that's really powerful about that is that you can take that information and you can put it in relevant meetings. Like you can put it into agenda documents, you can put it into in agenda documents, you can put it into meeting invites, etc. You can bookmark things. So URLs are really powerful there. Now, to make these things very accessible and show up where you want them to be used. The thing that is not that URLs don't achieve is they don't come to you necessarily. I mean, if you put them into a meeting agenda document, that can be very helpful because as you're going through the agenda, you can be opening those reports. Email and Slack distributions can be particularly powerful in order to make sure that this information actually comes to us and make sure that like we're seeing it where we live. And that way, as a manager, you can make sure that you're not like, you're not missing these things because they don't come to you because you didn't say, oh, you know what, I should really go look at that dashboard right now, but instead you can't avoid it. And so having these things come directly to you as a manager or coming to an email listserv or what have you can be can be very powerful there. Kind of the other mechanisms for distribution, historically, people like to put these things on TVs and on sales floors and what have you. I've never really been a fan of that because I've always thought it was like, it just turned into wallpaper. People would just walk by, like no one would actually look at it. It was more kind of along the lines of like, hey, we actually are very data driven, even though no one's paying attention to this because these monitors are sitting on top, like hanging down over the sales floor. In a current kind of like distributed organization, work from home environment, that's all the more problematic there. Like nobody was ever paying attention to those TVs before, and then certainly they're not paying attention to them now, which is why bringing it into the places where people actually live, like their email, Slack, etc., is a much more powerful way of doing so. Cool. And then of course you can put this information into decks, and you can also have and for assets for distribution, this is oftentimes where sales operations gets involved. And then a more modern version of this, which is kind of like an emerging functionality and feature, is this notion of like alerting, right? And so instead of just the dashboards coming to us and us then looking through them in order to find potential issues, if we can have software, like specifically dedicated software to do this analysis for us, and then emails us in order to say, hey, Pete, this individual, right, you may have, you would have to see this using your eyes in this dashboard, but this individual right here has 30% fewer customer facing meetings this month as compared to all of their peers, right? So that would be an example of a learning email that can specifically come to you as a manager with the specific insight that needs to be acted on. Cool. The last thing that you can do that's really powerful here is to use calendar events as well. I'm a big fan of most of my calendar events have actually agenda item or like agenda documents hyperlinked off. And so I like to put hyperlinks to various assets in those agenda documents. If you want to do a more basic version of that, you can actually have those assets, those reports and those dashboards hyperlinked directly in the calendar invite in question. And so you can kind of like see what this looks like in practice here. So like this is a Monday team meeting, meeting invite here with some key dashboards and some reports here. You can see that the same thing is going on here with respect to reports that have been bookmarked here in our taking advantage of that URL capability, the fact that they can be bookmarked, they've been hyperlinked or what have you. And then this is an example of doing that in an agenda document. So if you have an agenda document for your one-on-ones or your team meetings or what have you, you can literally have those hyperlinks present in those assets, and such that as you as a manager spend time preparing, like 15 minutes or 30 minutes preparing for this meeting, what you can do is you can literally just go through here and open those reports and say, cool, what deals came in last week? Or how was our customer facing meeting volume last week? Or how's our forward looking forecast looking like? And so by having those hyperlinks present there, what you're doing is you're ensuring the consumption and interpretation of those reports in order for you to then detect issues and then drive action accordingly. Wonderful. And then these are kind of examples of what this might look like by broadcasting this information out to people via email or via Slack. Again, the idea here is that we want to get this in front of people so they can see what's going on and they can take action rather when things are still issues before they become problems. And this is an example of like what an operating rhythm of meetings with the relevant assets might look like there. So for instance, you might have on a Monday, kind of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you might have daily stand-ups. And then maybe on a Monday, you have a sales team meeting. And then on a Wednesday, you might have your pipeline review. And then on your Thursday, you might have one-on-ones with with your individual team members. And then there would be assets, as kind of looked at previously, with each of those meetings. And in this regard, you now have an operating rhythm that has data kind of woven throughout it, in order to make sure that you never are missing anything there. And so this can this right here shows what that looks like in practice and what an agenda might be for, like, your midday stand-up. What are the things that you're doing in that meeting, and then what are the relevant like reporting and metrics that might be present there. So for instance, a midday stand-up, you might have just like a really quick review of week-to-date metrics and kind of call out any issues. A sales team meeting on a Monday, it might be looking back at the previous week and kind of where things are at that month, et cetera. And so what you want to think about is like, what is the relevant content for that meeting in order to then inform what assets need to be built for that. Wonderful. So the next question would be, all right, well, that's fantastic, but what happens when things change? when in this case, when the poop emoji hits the fan here. And really what that kind of comes down to is how you need to pivot by looking at kind of like what your new baselines might be, and then inform that throughout the rest of your goals. So, this happened in early 2020 when the coronavirus pandemic kind of like ramped up. A lot of organizations suddenly had negative impacts to their business, and they had to like kind of look at what new realities might be. So there's a couple of different steps that you'd have to take in order to do this. One, you got to figure out your new baselines. And so what that's going to mean is like looking at, it's kind of like a goal resetting situation, kind of like what we talked about before. So you got to figure out those new baselines. Then you got to set new goals based on that, and then enforce those new baselines. And then once you've done that, ideally what you do is you kind of like cascade upwards to the plan of record in order to make sure that like the ground truth reality is like reinforming your financial model for your CEO, your CFO, your head of operations, etc. Right? And so one, if we're going to go ahead and figure out our new baselines, this is kind of like goal resetting. Probably the things that we would want to look at most importantly there would be like the key indicators for the AE revenue formula, or the SDR formula. There, so like bookings, new opportunities, win rate, average selling price, deal cycle. The next thing that you're going to want to do is say, okay, how long of a sampling period do we need in order to understand what like the new reality looks like there? And that's going to change kind of depending on the that's going to change depending on that's going to be different depending on the organization sales motion in question. So for instance, if you have a pretty quick sales motion, then you might say, and then the other thing is going to be dependent on is what the metric actually is. So for instance, in this case, we're looking at first meeting volume change for an 8-rep mid-market AE team. Well, you're probably going to be able to figure out what the change, because it's customer facing meeting volume, that's going to change pretty quickly. And so seeing a drop over a couple of weeks is something where you could see what a new baseline might look like there, versus something where you might be looking at bookings. Well, it might take a while for that to kind of shake its way out. Like if your deal cycle is 60 days or 90 days or what have you, it's going to take a while for that information to kind of like go all the way through, to kind of make its way all the way through there. Cool. So then the next thing that we would want to do there is figuring out those, oops, sorry about that, I skipped one here. And so this is, using the revenue formula in order to inform that, or doing that with the SDR formula. For an SDR team would be the mechanism by which you kind of figure out what those new baselines look like. Cool. And so then once you've done that, what you want to there's a couple of different things that are going to be impacting the mechanism, or impacting how long it's going to take you to figure out these sets of these new realities. So an example of that might be the number of reps that you have. If you have a fewer number of reps, like your sampling is going to be lower, right? If you have a much higher number of reps, your sampling is going to be much more frequent. You're going to be able to figure out what's happening there much more quickly. Same with like sales motion velocity. If you have a much faster sales motion, whether you're talking about like SDR having a quick prospecting motion, or if you're an SMB sales organization that sells to like, local businesses or what have you, you're going to be able to figure out what these new baselines are a lot more quickly. Whereas if you're, an enterprise sales motion, it's going to take a lot longer for that information to kind of shake its way out. And the same is true with respect to like precursor metrics versus output metrics. If it's a precursor metric like customer facing email volume or response rates from customers, or first meeting volume or what have you, you're going to be able to see what those changes look like much more quickly, versus an output metric that might take a little bit more time to kind of like shake its way out there. And so then once you have that information in place, what you'll want to be able to do is then set new goals on those and then cascade it to the rest of the org. And so oftentimes what that can mean is, if for whatever reason it's a lot harder to take to get new opportunity, or first meetings on the calendar, well, if those account executives aren't having the same volume of first meetings, well, guess what? Like, first meetings are the things that lead to eventual bookings. Well, we may need to like re-baseline what our actual bookings targets might be, because this precursor metric isn't at the same levels that it was previously. The same might be true with SDRs as well, where if we're not getting the level of responsiveness, or we're not getting the connect rates that we used to, we can put in the same amount of activity, but the outputs aren't there. That's going to necessarily impact our opportunity creation volume or our meeting volume there. Cool. And so then the last thing that I'd like to kind of touch on here is on using this information to do troubleshooting and resolution. And so it's insufficient for us to just have this information at our fingertips if we just don't do anything with it. And so the mechanism by which we do this troubleshooting and then seek to resolve these issues is through kind of like a loop, right? Where we want to detect what's going on, diagnose what the potential root cause is there, communicate that problem to somebody, or to the rep in question, or to the team in question, or like start that conversation, figure out what the potential solution path is there, and then loop back again to see, okay, cool, did the solution that we were discussing, did it actually fix the problem? And so it's this loop of like detecting, diagnosing, communicating the resolution, and then looping back. That's essentially that managerial loop right there is what's going to lead to better outcomes for your team. And to kind of like look at what this looks like in practice here, couple things here. One is trends can kind of show you these issues in question, where you can see, oh, okay, here's somebody who's having, I guess I can't mouse here. The person so Queen of Hearts, who's got the green targets around there, is jamming along. Okay, had a little bit of a dip there on March 15th, and then pop back up again, as compared to Brer Rabbit in the orange, who has been deteriorating over time and then stays pretty low. And then all the way down to Judy Hopps in dark blue, who has been pretty low consistently across the board. And so by looking at these trends, we can see whether or not there's something to be intervened on. In the case of Queen of Hearts, there's maybe less of a problem to be addressed. Like, there's a little bit of a bump down and then a bump up again, versus Judy Hopps here might be, for consistent low meeting volume over time, probably an opportunity for us to engage and have a conversation with that person and see if we can solve those problems. You can do the same thing with respect to goals by setting goals on these things, and then specifically saying, hey, this is where we landed last week, or this is where we're at this month, progressing towards this month. Let's take an action based on this. So in this case, we can see there's kind of two goals that are off substantially. There's an email volume goal that's like a little bit off, maybe could do a little bit more of activity. And then there's a pipeline management goal in the form of untouched opportunities, where somebody is dramatically off as compared to what their pipe management targets might be. And again, this is something where using specific alerting and anomaly detection can be extremely powerful, because because having that information come to you rather than having to use your eyeballs in order to detect things can be extremely powerful to say, hey, this individual right here, Angel 624, has 40% fewer new opportunities coming into their pipeline as compared to everybody else. Let's go ahead and get ahead of that before that becomes a bookings problem in one deal cycle from now. And again, this is something that when you're doing this troubleshooting and diagnosis, what you can do is you can see whatever the problem is and then kind of move right over time. Like if for instance you have a bookings problem here, you can say, oh, okay, where's this bookings problem coming from? Is it coming from too few wins? Is it coming from too low average selling price? Or is it coming from an elongated deal cycle? And if it's coming from too few wins, we can then go upstream from that and say, oh, okay, is that because their win rate is off as compared to historically? Or is there or are they not getting as many at bats and attempts? And so by going right in that regard, what you can do is you can figure out what the root cause is and then seek to solve that specific root cause, which will then have a positive impact on the downstream KPIs. And you can do the same thing in the SDR on the SDR side of things as well. Wonderful. So I think that's all that we wanted to go through today. I really appreciate everybody kind of hanging tough during the technical issues there. Again, if you would like a copy of 5 Secrets of the Sales Coach, the Qualified Sales Leader, and a Coffees for Closers mugs, please do go ahead and hit the hyperlink that's being dropped in the chat there, and we can get you set up for that. And then we also have another upcoming event on March 2nd that's focused on Moneyball for sales. We're going to be doing a live demo of Atrium there. So if you want to go ahead and sign up for that, there's a hyperlink here. We're going to drop that into the chat room there as well. But otherwise, actually, we'll go ahead and, since we have a little bit more time here, we could potentially answer some questions there. So Chuck Moore had a question around, like, is Atrium specifically a manager tool, or can this be used as an AE to track territory and activity? The answer to that, of course, is that it can be helpful for both. It's primarily a manager tool, but of course, reps want to be managing themselves like a business, and so to the extent that they can see their various levels of KPIs, and if they're engaging in the right levels of activity, and if their various pipeline hygiene metrics are in place, that can be a very powerful thing as well. John had a question here around adding multiple layers to dashboarding in Atrium, or higher level mass statistics, like for instance, gauging SDR efficiency on accounts and contacts touch on top of number of touches in order to before next opportunity creation. Yeah, that's actually something that Atrium does right now. There's kind of more basic metrics and then more advanced metrics as well. So for instance, Atrium does pay attention to things, at least with respect to SDRs, like activity per opportunity created, like the historical averages for a given individual rep, and what can be done with that is a manager or also the software can just pay attention to if a rep is engaging, if an SDR is engaging in sufficient activity in order to get to their opportunity creation goals based on their historical activity to opportunity created ratios. So that's actually something that Atrium currently does right now, and ends up actually being very powerful for folks. Wonderful. So I think that's all that we have here. So I think what we can do is, Eduardo.
Hi, that was amazing. Thank you very much. We are going to wrap things up for now, but first we want to thank everyone for attending and for hanging with us while we were having trouble at the beginning, but I'm pretty sure you were able to learn a lot from Pete. I learned a lot. Thank you, Pete, for this amazing presentation, and thank you, Atrium. And while Pete and I hang out backstage, our MSP team will make sure the recording and the key takeaways are available on our MSP website shortly. And once you are there, to check the recording, don't forget to check our upcoming events, just like the one that Pete just mentioned. Join us for a live demo, Moneyball for Sales, and stay safe, and you will see you next time. Thank you for joining us.